Chapter 12, Patriotism. World War II was only yesterday. Russia's past was wonderful, her present magnificent, and as to her future, it is beyond the grasp of the most daring imagination. This is the point of view from which Russian history must be written. Count Alexander ben Cordov, secret police chief, the 1830s. 8 of us were gathered around Ben Levich's dinner table, all talking at once. So many complaints were being raised by Ben's relatives about the vexations of life in Moscow today, that I deliberately changed the subject by asking them what had been the best period in Russian history. Conversation came to a halt. Ben, whose round, pink face always had a look of boyish, pop-eyed wonder, despite his 60-odd years, seemed to fumble for thought. As a ranking scientist, he had prospered under the system until applying in '72 to emigrate to Israel, and he still had the establishment feelings of a Jew who has long been well assimilated and comfortable. "How do you mean best?" Ben stalled, eyes popping. "Materially, morally, that's up to you," I shrugged. It was a minute or two before he replied. "The best time of our lives," he said finally, "was the war." His answer surprised me, and evidently the others as well. Ben grinned shyly, obviously pleased to have caught us off guard. Given the enormous devastation and suffering that all Soviet people associate with World War II, the immediate astonishment was understandable. Moreover, this was a company of skeptics, reluctant to echo or endorse any cliché of Soviet propaganda, especially one so constantly invoked as the Soviet victory in World War II. The war, Ben repeated quietly, because at that time we all felt closer to our government than at any other time in our lives. It was not their country then, but our country. It was not they who wanted this or that to be done, but we who wanted to do it. It was not their war, but our war. It was our country, and we were defending our war effort. I remember I was in Kazan, in my room sleeping. Ben went on, his choppy Russian speech accented here and there with a word in English, and in the middle of the night someone from the Cheka secret police came and woke me up, and I was afraid. Think of it. He knocked on my door in the middle of the night and woke me up, and I was not afraid. If some Chekist had done that in the '30s, I would have been terrified. If it had happened after the war, just before Stalin died, it would have been just as frightening. That, too, was a time of blood purges, especially for Jews. If someone did that now, I would be very worried, even though the situation has changed. But then, during the war, I was absolutely unafraid. It was a unique time in our history. They wanted me to take part in some very important meeting. They were afraid chemical warfare was beginning. I was a specialist in chemistry, and they wanted my opinion. By the time Ben had finished, the others around the table were in agreement. In spite of their disdain for Soviet propaganda, these were patriotic emotions they understood. Those who were old enough to remember shared the memories. Elsewhere, too, I learned that these were not merely the sentiments of an isolated, fortunate Jewish scientist in his 60s, but of people from all walks of life. The war was the one time when poets were writing poetry sincerely, commented an alienated linguist in her 50s. Other people often spoke of the war not only as a time of suffering and sacrifice, but also a time of belonging and solidarity. The war had meant death and destruction, but it had also demonstrated indestructible unity and invincible power, and the memory of the shared ordeal and triumph in what the Soviet people call the Great Patriotic War is a primary source of the unblushing patriotism that they feel today. In an age grown skeptical of undiluted patriotism, Russians are perhaps the world's most passionate patriots. Without question, a deep and tenacious love of country is the most powerful unifying force in the Soviet Union, the most vital element in the amalgam of loyalties that cements Soviet society. That may sound commonplace for other countries which have no proclaimed political ideology. Indeed, before the revolution, ardent national patriotism was a hallmark of Russia. The paradox today lies in the fact that Lenin and other revolutionary leaders, only a minority of whom were ethnic Russians, set out to break that tradition. "We are anti-patriots," Lenin declared in 1915. The Bolshevik creed of world revolution and proletarian solidarity condemned narrow national loyalties to heresy. It was Stalin seeking to rally the Russian people against the invading Nazi armies, who deliberately built up Russian nationalist fervor. In 1928, with the first 5-year plan, and again bit by bit in the 1930s, he had invoked the inspiration of Tsarist heroes. But by the war, he was so intent on promoting patriotic zeal that he even resuscitated the persecuted Orthodox Church. He and the Orthodox Patriarch would make joint radio appeals to the nation, and in the years since the war, the hold of patriotism has grown as communist fervor has waned, so that today nationalism has more magnetism and meaning for the overwhelming majority of Soviet people than does Marxist-Leninist ideology. Nationalism, the worship of the motherland, has become a substitute for all other forms of belief. One of my younger scientist friends commented, "It may have been an exaggeration, but not much of one. Take away national patriotism, and what do our people have?" He continued, "Before the revolution, Russians believed in 3 things: in God, the Tsar, and only third, the homeland. And after the revolution, especially in the 1920s, but also in the 1930s, people believed in socialist proletarian internationalism. It was wrong to assert Russian nationalism. We against them. You could get in trouble for that, but with the war, Stalin emphasized nationalism. Since then, it has been growing. Now people do not have God or the Tsar or socialist internationalism. They have Russia, Rodina, the motherland, and the party makes great use of this." Others too remarked to me how shrewdly and frequent the Soviet leadership plays upon emotions of national loyalty. It is an appeal that must be managed with great delicacy because of the historic frictions between ethnic Russians and other nationalities, like Georgians, Armenians, Lithuanians, or Uzbeks, who now comprise a majority of the Soviet population and who often privately resent the Russification of their minority republics. What makes World War II so valuable as a propaganda device is that it lends itself to blurring the distinction between the devotion of ethnic Russians to Mother Russia and the attachment of minority nationalities to their own regions. It allows propagandists to meld these peoples together in common loyalty to the broader entity of the Soviet Union. It also enables them to fuzz the line between patriotic pride in the national military victory over the Nazis and political commitment to the Soviet system. In the propaganda of the Great Patriotic War, patriotism and politics are thus fused. With that same purpose, the Soviet press today heralds Soviet space exploits and international sports victories. Big-time sports in the Soviet system are not entertainment, as in the West, but politics, which is one reason why Soviet sports are so thoroughly subsidized, and why top performers are secretly provided extra perquisites and handsome cash bonuses, especially for gold medal showings abroad. Sports champions, so goes the party line, prove the superiority of Soviet socialism. It is no accident that the Soviets are often the ones who seize every opportunity at the Olympic Games or other international competitions to insist on playing national anthems, displaying national flags, or performing march pasts and other rituals that cater to national feelings and keep aflame the Soviet sense of patriotism and national pride. Sports like World War II are a perfect vehicle for this type of propaganda. Ethnic Russians, passionate patriots by nature and tradition, readily warm to nationalistic appeals. In almost any situation, they can take their patriotism straight and thrive on it. Where else would long-distance trains depart with loudspeakers playing anthems? Where else would an audience sit through a full evening of hymns and paeans to the homeland without feeling it maudlin? I remember one concert hall of Russians moved to tears and emotional applause by a misty-eyed baritone fervently singing patriotic refrains by Yevtushenko against the stirring rumble of timpanis and the sweep of violins. Motherland of Pushkin, motherland of Lenin, motherland of our children, long live, long reign, the great sovereign people. On another evening, a stout journalist and his wife happily recited to me in their kitchen the lyrics of one of the currently best-selling pop tunes, "Where Does Our Motherland Begin?" with the picture in your little primer, with good and true comrades who live in the home next door, or maybe it begins with the song that mother sang. Sensing my uneasiness at such saccharine sentimentality, the husband quickly reassured me. It's a very good song, our teenage daughter likes it, and so do all her friends. Russians of all ages are as sentimental about Mother Russia as about their own families. My middle-aged language teacher broke into tears one morning as she recalled how she had crossed the border into Russia on a train a few years ago after living abroad on a diplomatic assignment. Just hearing the word Rodina makes me tremble, confessed a young woman biologist who had known a grim childhood in a rough industrial town and was now generally critical of things Soviet. The emotional force of that word Rodina for her and other Russians is untranslatable. By the dictionary, it means native land, mother country, homeland, land of one's birth, yet all these fall short of the evocative power of the word in Russian. Rodina, to Russians, has the ring of "my country, 'tis of thee," that singing devotion to country, unreasoning, unquestioning, unstinting, the way a mother loves her smallest child, and the child blindly returns that love, a constancy and homage that makes the individual forget all the petty nuances, harassments, inefficiencies, and entanglements of daily life, and proclaim his loyalty, take pride in it, merge himself somehow with the nation, and find there comfort, confidence, and a sense of community that nowadays eludes Americans and many other Westerners. For Russians, Rodina stirs the gut patriotism that freedom and democracy used to do for Americans. It is an umbilical word that expresses much more of what holds the country and people together than a multitude of diagrams about the structure of the Communist Party, for it evokes the blood attachment of Russians to their native soil and to each other. It captures the profound spiritual meaning that the nation has for the Russian psyche. Even immigrants who have turned their backs on the Soviet Union politically find they are no more immune from the pull of Russia than from the pull of gravity. Cut off from her, many feel a void. David Bonavia, a British correspondent, wrote wisely about the paradoxical loyalty of distant intellectuals. They are like the man who beats his wife, swears at her vilely by day, and then crawls into bed to make love to her at night. They love Russia, even those who divorce and leave. A Moscow friend told me of a Russian woman who had lived 40 years in Paris and who, after her first chance to visit Russia, flew back to Paris with the one gift that all of her immigrant friends had prayed for, a suitcase full of Russian earth. I have met Jews in the West who fought bitterly for the right to immigrate and then suddenly felt themselves cruelly uprooted and desperately homesick once they were abroad. Spiritually, culturally, I'm Russian. One such man protested to me vehemently in New York. In the same vein, the poet Joseph Brodsky, after arriving in the West to live, wrote Brezhnev, yearning to be preserved as a part of Russian literature. The return of Marc Chagall in 73, after half a century in exile, was an emotional homecoming that evinced all the passionate attachments of Slavic peoples to their native soil. When Henry Kalm, a New York Times colleague in Paris, saw Chagall after his visit, he found the Ukrainian-born Jewish painter positively radiant and rejuvenated. It seemed like the return of the prodigal. Before Chagall had been read out of the family, ignored, not exhibited, even scorned as an antagonist of socialist realism. None of that had mattered now. Chagall was immensely flattered that the Soviets would want him, would show a few of his works that had been locked up in the vaults for decades, would ask him to sign the murals he had done for the old Jewish State Theater. Back in Paris, buoyant and refreshed, he thrust a vase containing 2 dried bouquets of Russian flowers under Kalm's nose and commanded, "Smell, smell, no other flowers have that smell. I've not known it in 50 years." The passionate patriotism of the Russians contains not only this deep and unwavering love of the homeland which Chagall, even as a Jew, shared, but also a kind of primeval sense of community, a clannish defensiveness toward outsiders and intolerance towards renegades from within, a Victorian pride in national power and empire, of blinding ethnocentrism, and of conviction of moral superiority that echoes America's earlier age of innocence. Now, as in centuries past, Russians have a love of country that overlooks all blemishes. John Steinbeck, writing of such a love, once said about New York, "It is an ugly city, a dirty city. Its climate is a scandal. Its politics are used to frighten children. Its traffic is madness. Its competition is murderous. But there is one thing about it. Once you have lived in New York and it has become your home, no other place is good enough. Russians may not be as brash, cocky, or candid, but their loyalty to country is just as dogged and forgiving." As if in response to Steinbeck, Russians today will quote a famous line from Pushkin, "Even the smoke of our motherland is sweet and pleasant to us." If immigration were suddenly totally free, I am confident that very few Russians, as distinct from Jews and some other minorities, would leave their country permanently. In part, this is a measure of their parochial isolation. They are not accustomed to coming and going. For 95% of the citizenry or more, the gate to the outside world is never opened, or once opened, it clangs shut forever afterward, and painful nostalgia sets in at once. Were the gate left permanently ajar, inertia and fear of the unknown, life abroad would be powerful deterrents to many Russians. But most of all, they would be held back by the pull of the homeland and their own folk, for they have an almost peasant, tied to the land and clan mentality that is difficult for people from the mobile, commercial civilizations of America and Western Europe to comprehend. Historically, Russians have been a people of great social cohesion. They are comfortable attached to the group, uneasy cut off from it. Today, as a sacred entity in Soviet mythology, the collective ranks second only to the Communist Party itself. The work collective at farm or, or factory is supposed to do much more than unite a brigade of workers on the job. The farm or factory paternalistically provides housing, schooling, and other services, organizes leisure activities, and sometimes even monitors private life as well. Workers get a great kick in going off fishing together on a company-provided bus. So much is the collective spirit pushed that I found people talking about it unselfconsciously all the time. Even in our small office, we and our Russian employees constantly joked about the New York Times collective. But the roots of communalism in Russia run much deeper than contemporary party propaganda. The hardy conquest of wild forest lands by peasants a millennium ago was a group endeavor. Under the later czars, planting and harvesting were organized by the village mir or assembly on a communal basis. In the Orthodox Church, confession was a public ritual symbolizing the sinner's return to the community of worshippers, and the individual learned to subordinate and merge himself into the common fold. The contrast with Western historical evolution is dramatic. From the Reformation forward, Western life has emphasized the separateness of the individual in church and commerce and has proclaimed his freedom to be different. Even the celebrated American penchant for joining civic clubs and other groups provides much looser and more superficial ties than those of the Russian to his collective and to his nation. On a personal level, the Russian merges with those around him less self-consciously than the Anglo-Saxon. I was struck by how they bump into each other, touch each other, lean against each other in public quite naturally and without concern. In communal worker apartments or student dormitories, Russians live in closeness that many Westerners would find claustrophobic. They take for granted sharing hotel rooms or six-bed railway compartments with utter strangers. The Russian language does not have a word for privacy. In the natural order of things, the individual simply takes second place to the collective. To me, the Russian sense of sacrifice for the group and the nation was an attractive quality, but I was put off by the code of group conformism that tried to get the individual to conceive of himself primarily as a cog in a group machine, making excommunication from the group the most severe social penalty, whether merely the banishment of an unruly child from a kindergarten playgroup or the forcible deportation of Alexander Solzhenitsyn for his dissident writings. We learned from our history that to survive we must band together as Russians. Anatoly, a 30-year-old government economist, told me the Tatars came and conquered us when we were living in separate princedoms, each one practically with its own borders. We were many more people, we Russians, and the Tatars were few, and still they punched through us like a strong fist. And so we have learned we must band together, rather like the Jews, though that sounds funny. The Jews have banded together, and now their nationalism calls them to gather in their new homeland. But our homeland calls on us to stay here, so we stay. It sounds like the opposite thing, but it is really the same feeling. We have many sayings about our sense of loyalty. Maybe you have heard of Marshal Suvorov, the great army commander who defeated the troops of Frederick the Great and later Napoleon. He used to say, "Pust kuzek ta nash," let it be worse, but let it be ours. When I suggested that in English, which he knew, this came across as my country, right or wrong, something which we called blind patriotism. He readily agreed. We call it Quasnoi Patriotism. Kvass Patriotism. he said. Like so many essentials of Russian life, the phrase does not readily lend itself to translation, for one has to know that kvass is a fermented peasant drink made from water dripped through burnt bread. Kvass has a malty flavor, and cheap kvass can be like old coffee, bitter, the color of muddy water, with grounds at the bottom. In cities all over Russia, white-coated women serve up glass mugs of kvass from large saffron-colored mobile metal kegs in the summertime. Foreigners usually pass up a second mug, but Russians swear by it, and peasants produce their own home brew of kvass. So Kvass, patriotism, represents the earthy, peasanty, intensely Russian brand of patriotism. Chauvinism, I asked. Yes, chauvinism, and something even stronger, Anatoly affirmed. It is a patriotism that breeds and believes in legends, like those of our own John Paul Jones and Davy Crockett. Such tales tumble from Russian lips readily. Anatoly remembered the brave exploits of the border troops who opposed the Nazis, and the Russian defenders at Brest, fighting valiantly through though outnumbered and forced to surrender. This positive heroic devotion to country, however, has its negative McCarthyist side in rigid intolerance and persecution of mavericks and dissenters, whom the Klan regards as unpardonable renegades. People will do almost anything when they believe the motherland is in danger, Anatoly said. This applies not only to a military danger, but to an ideological danger, because the country is being invaded by alien ideas. You see, it is quite natural for people to consider men like Sakharov and Zelensky as traitors. It is very simple. Sakharov and Zelensky are turning to foreigners to help. Our conversation took place in '73 after a virulent press campaign against these two leading dissidents. The imperialists are using these two, and you have to understand that no matter what else is said, imperialism is still our main enemy. So if our enemy is using these people, then naturally it must mean that they are traitors. Sakharov called for the West to punish our country, to keep us from getting most favored nation tariffs from the United States. So of course he's considered a traitor, and it is a normal duty for people to join a campaign to denounce him. He paused for a minute before expressing disappointment, but not the kind I had expected. National feelings are weakening among some of the intelligentsia nowadays, he said. Some people hesitate to join the campaign against Sakharov and Zelensky. It is not as automatic as it should be. Any foreigner who has ever questioned or challenged the Soviet way of life or its government, even mildly, has inevitably encountered this same clannish loyalty. Whatever their private thoughts, Russians close ranks and rise to the defense of their nation against the outsider. Nor is this merely parroting of official propaganda, for I have heard dissidents suddenly switch positions when a foreigner offers the same criticism of their country that they themselves have expressed. National pride before foreigners is an immensely powerful emotion. A magazine editor told me that I was mistaken if I thought Russians had to be coached by officials on what to tell foreigners. Even without prompting, he said, common people exaggerate their standard of living to Westerners, visiting their homes and factories. It is natural, he said. People feel we are Russians. We must appear well before foreigners. We must show them, Americans especially, that we live well. What is at work here is an instinctive, tribal-like loyalty reflex, for just as Russians, in their personal relations, draw sharp distinction between the inner ring of trusted friends and all outsiders. So in their national feelings, they distinguish sharply between their clan, their nation, and all others. Words like nash, or, and shukoi, other for foreign alien, crop up constantly in both propaganda and conversation. They have immense force in delineating friend and foe, and in fixing attitudes. For Russians think in terms of only two sides, for and against. They have an ingrained skepticism toward neutrality. He is against. They have an ingrained he is nash, our man, or just the opposite. He is shazoi on the other side, is enough to settle an issue. That same young woman who trembled at the very sound of the word Rodina remembered her rage as a teenager whenever Western radio broadcasts transmitted unpleasant news about Russia. When I heard Voice of America, I knew that what they said about Russia was true, absolutely true, but it still made me mad, she said. There was something insulting about hearing it from outsiders. It was as if foreigners were laughing at us. It did not make me angry so much at our system as at Voice of America. These same feelings of resentment against the outsider are deftly activated today by the most experienced Soviet propagandist. Yuri Zakov, the Pravda columnist and television commentator, warned Soviet listeners in late '74 to beware of sly tactics of Russian language radio broadcasts by foreign stations, in terms precisely calculated to raise the hackles of the Soviet patriot. In our nash bright, clean Soviet home steals a stranger, chazoi, and speaking our nash language disseminates lies and slander. The immensity of Russia and its continental isolation through long periods of history have left many Russians today with a strong streak of moral chauvinism. In part, this is sheer ethnocentrism. Like other large nations, China, America, Russia sees the world revolving around it and gauges all others by its own standards. Russians have a traditional saying that all nations see the world from their own bell towers, and the Russian tower is the tallest. This sense of moral superiority took root after the Russian embrace of Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. Under the Tsars, Russians came to regard Moscow as the third Rome, the protector of the one true Christian faith after Byzantium fell. This historic ethnocentrism and sense of mission were perpetuated and reinforced by the Bolshevik Revolution, seen by Russians as the major event of the 20th century. The messianic ideology of Marxism-Leninism has not only claimed Moscow as the new Jerusalem, but as the only legitimate interpreter of communism, to which revolutionaries from all over the world must pay court and allegiance. So far, Soviet Russia has escaped the kind of cultural pessimism that has afflicted the West. With less reason than in a number of other countries, Russians retain a basic, unquestioning confidence in their way of life. They gripe about shortages, prices, or corruption, or privately dream of some tinkering reforms, but they do not engage in the agonies of self-doubt, the vehement denigration of their own country, or the fits of despair that have tortured Americans or other Westerners in recent years. Indeed, I remember one elderly Russian telling me that Soviet war veterans, no matter how antagonistic toward the American intervention in Vietnam, simply could not conceive of how young American veterans could have brought themselves to throw back their war decorations at Congress in protest over the Vietnam War. It was an insult not just to the government but to the nation that Russians with their vibrant patriotism simply could not countenance. He said, "Very few Russians, for that matter, ever wonder whether some other way is better, or whether their system should be fundamentally changed any more than one wonders about whether to change one's parents? They are confident of Mother Russia as rock and refuge. It rarely seems to dawn on Russians, except for dissidents, that their land may be unvirtuous or guilty of moral transgressions. Their sense of moral innocence is as unshaken today as was that of Americans before the awful agony of Vietnam introduced to some a sense of national guilt and capacity for evil. Protecting Russians from that sense, I suspect, is one reason why the Soviet leadership has felt it so terribly important to suppress not just the truth about the Stalinist purges, but also the recognition that millions participated in these bloody repressions. For the Red Terror may have been ordered by one man, like Hitler's persecution of the Jews, but it was carried out by thousands upon thousands of people visiting hell upon their comrades as well as their competitors. This national guilt is what made Khrushchev's exposure of the Stalinist purges not only an extraordinary disclosure, but an extraordinary political act, fraught with dangerously unsettling emotions for all people, and undoubtedly for him as well, even though he found it a tactically useful maneuver. This is also what makes Solzhenitsyn such an explosively dangerous author for Russians, especially in his Gulag Archipelago. That book and his first works about the camps force Russian readers to face up to the evil that they, or their parents, or their countrymen committed. Instinctively, the regime understands that this awareness must be suppressed, not only because it challenges the Communist Party to admit responsibility and risk diminution of power, but also because it forces all people to face up to the national capacity for sin and act an act that could dilute the national patriotism that is such an essential part of the regime's legitimacy today. Paradoxically, despite the Russian sense of national moral superiority, much of the gutsy boastfulness in the Soviet press about the Soviet Union being first, largest, and best in every conceivable field seems a compensation for a deep-set national sense of inferiority toward the West in fields of science, technology, and commerce, and in the pragmatic achievements of the modern age. It was Stalin who promoted the Soviet fetish for claiming exaggerated preeminence for Russian achievements, even though he also spoke candidly about Russian backwardness and the compulsion to overcome it. Under his rule, the practice of chauvinistic exaggeration of Russian achievements reached ridiculous proportions. Encyclopedias were claiming that Alexander Popov, not Marconi, was the inventor of the radio, that Alexander Lozhin, not Thomas Edison, invented the electric light bulb, that Ivan Polzanov beat James Watt by 21 years to the steam engine, and Alexander Mozatsky was way ahead of the Wright brothers in putting the first airplane into the sky. After Stalin, the official policy of promoting such Russia First claims was toned down, but the practice still goes on in many publications today. Urban intellectuals, with their snobbish preference for things Western, often mock the agrarious chauvinism with the sarcastic put-down, Russia, home of the elephant. But at all levels of society, Soviet society, there exists a very strong conservative Russian conviction that ours is best, nasha lushe. It is a phrase that pops into conversation frequently and often without special reason. Riding an elevator in the tourist hotel before a large international reception one evening, I overheard two middle-aged Russian women admiring the cocktail dresses of several young Soviet women who were going to the reception. Although they were not as fashionably dressed as some of the foreign guests in the elevator, these two biddies were brimming with pride. "Aren't our girls attractive?" chirped one. "Yes, ours are the best," came the cliché response from the other. So automatically is this thought expressed by conservative-minded officialdom and by common people, whether talking about girls, dams, space exploits, tractors, or hockey teams, that more cosmopolitan young people relish the joke about the Communist Party official whose wife has just discovered that her husband has a ballerina for a mistress. She insists on going to the Bolshoi to see her rival. They are just settled in the box with other higher-ups when the curtain rises on a slender, fluttering swan. The wife nudges her husband and asks, "Is that the one?" "No," he replies, "that's Petrov's." "I'm glad," said his wife. "Her legs are too thin." A bit later the wife points to another feathery ballerina with a questioning eye. "No," says the husband, "that's Ivanov's." "Good," says the wife, "her face is not pretty." Finally the husband gestures to a ballerina in the back of the stage. The wife checks the young dancer, settles back in her seat with a smug smile, and clucks, "Nasha Dushe, ours is the best." This national self-esteem, regardless of circumstances, is reinforced by Victorian pride in the power of accomplishments of the Soviet Union. Volodya, the young Communist Party careerist, expressed it in his chauvinistic lordliness toward the Germans and other nations dependent on Soviet gas and oil. A British diplomatic friend who had often visited East Germany and occasionally talked with Russian soldiers found them envious of the German standard of living, but still feeling superior toward Germans, as if their affiliation with the muscle of Moscow compensated for all else. Only a minuscule handful of dissenters protested in Red Square against the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. They were arrested even before they could unfurl their banners. Hints of disapproval among some establishment intellectuals came out in Natalia Baranskaya's story about the Professional Woman's Week, one week like any other, when the wife suggested to the husband that they should discuss serious issues like Vietnam and Czechoslovakia. Keen-eyed Soviet intellectuals spotted that as a deftly dissident equation of Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia with American intervention in Vietnam. But beyond the substantial indifference to the invasion on the part of the masses, many people evidently took pride in the exercise of Soviet power, in the same way that 19th century Englishmen took pride in maintaining their imperial domain. It was one of the attributes of being a superpower. A Russian writer I know was vacationing at Sochi in August of '68 when Soviets began to get wind of the invasion from Western radio broadcast. "The people down there were really very happy with what happened," he recalled. "Finally," they said, "our troops have gone into Czechoslovakia. We should have done that a long time ago. Now we must go on and do the same in Romania." These people were glad to see that Russia had used its force. They respect that force very much. They like to see Russian power exercised. Gennady, the state farm accountant, said this was true among the farm officials and farm workers whom he knew as well. They believed in the huge, wild lie that the Soviet Union had to invade Czechoslovakia to help the people there, he said. The intervention was a matter of pride in their own nation. Another friend, the young scientist who had philosophized about nationalist fervor, found himself sharing a hospital ward with a civilian chauffeur who had been a tank driver in Prague during the invasion. The driver, by his account, was a thoroughly likable Russian, but as blind and brutal a patriot as American soldiers in My Lai. He told the scientist how he and his comrades had obliterated Czechoslovaks at the mere appearance of what they suspected as opposition. Let a local appear on a rooftop, and if he seemed menacing to the tank crew in any way, the driver said, we would aim our big gun at the building and blow off the top of it. The scientist, privately opposed to the intervention, evinced some misgivings about unnecessary killing, but the driver brushed it aside with his Kvass patriotism. He had no qualms, he said, because they were all fascists. As a people, Russians are just as emotionally devoted to peace as Americans, but the official propaganda treatment of war, harping on themes of vigilance and preparedness, is vastly greater than in the West, because the Vietnam War is an extremely divisive issue in America, but in the Soviet Union it is an unchallenged unifying element that serves to justify many of today's policies. Even in an era of détente and as an antidote to it, the Soviet leadership has quite deliberately tapped the wellspring of World War II to keep Soviet feelings of patriotism live and vibrant. Not surprisingly, for example, many of the letter writers who were quickest to denounce dissidents like Sakharov and Zelensky, or to warn of the dangers of Western ideological penetration, identified themselves as war veterans. Spy movies and war memoirs not infrequently state or imply that the West, even during the wartime alliance, could not be trusted. The constant wartime picture of Russia besieged is an implicit justification for the continuation of the draft, for high school military training, for heavy military expenditures, and for the sacrifices that Soviet consumers must make because America, Germany, and other capitalist economies of the West are allegedly driven by munitions industries that will never let defense expenditures turn downward. For most Americans, World War II is now a distant and insignificant abstraction, a chapter of near-ancient history, a drama played on an other stage. As a nation, we do not feel in our bone and muscle the wrenching, wounding memories of Europeans. We cannot appreciate how strongly the French, the Poles, or the Russians feel in their blood toward the Germans, nor can we grasp the emotional impact of old war stories on their present mood. Our relations with Germany have been defined by a new era, a new commerce, a new diplomacy. In America, scrapbooks and war medals may be taken out on a rainy afternoon. Occasionally, a new book on Potsdam or a film on the Normandy invasion appears, but the palpable feel of the war is gone. Korea and Vietnam have blurred the memory and diminished the importance of World War II as a national experience and as a factor in contemporary politics. The contrast with the Russians could not be more vivid or more revealing. The war for them has a mystique. In restaurants or hotels or on trains and airplanes, utter strangers will suddenly be swapping war stories after discovering that they had been sergeants or nurses, colonels or correspondents on the same front or passed through the same cities or rail junctions during the same campaigns. Those who had been only children recall with grim satisfaction their having survived years of living on meager bread rations as refugees in Tashkent, Kuibyshev, the Urals, or some other far-off point separated from parents while Hitler's armies encircled Leningrad or menaced Moscow. The annual reunions of old war units are occasions that Russians love to attend because, unlike political meetings, they touch authentic emotions. The very words at the front still have an almost religious ring in Soviet life. 3 decades after the war, and veterans wear their decorations proudly in public on many occasions. The Soviets seem to take literally the motto, "Nothing and no one shall be forgotten." No Westerner visiting the Soviet Union can fail to be struck by the constant harping on the war, the ever-present theme of that Holocaust, the war as an explanation for the Soviet economic lag behind the West, and the feeling that for Soviet people, the war ended only yesterday. Entering Moscow by the airport road, the traveler passes a monument of huge, stark tank traps, like three huge jacks, symbolic of how close the Nazi advance came to the capital and where the Russians turned it back. In Odessa, tourists are taken through the grottos where partisans hid out during the occupation by German and Romanian troops. The Romanians, now communist, are conveniently forgotten as former enemies by contemporary tour guides. In Lithuania, a gaunt mother statue epitomizes the sorrow of a little nation caught in the terrible crossfire of two massive armies. Let President Nixon pay 2 visits to the Soviet Union, and he is taken on the first to the Piskarevka Cemetery in Leningrad, acres of graves of the war dead, an awful reminder of the terrible human cost of the 900-day siege of that city. And then, 2 years later, the Katyn in Byelorussia, where a memorial and a bronze statue of a man tenderly holding his dying young son commemorates the razing of a village and the burning alive of 149 villagers by Nazi troops who suspected them of aiding guerrillas operating behind Nazi lines. So it is everywhere. Practically no city or village in European Russia, Belorussia, the Ukraine, or the Baltic states is without its war memorial, its grave markers, its eternal flame to the war dead. In a place like the Northern Caucasus, where Nazi forces captured the peak of Elbrus and pushed toward the oil city of Baku, war memorials play up the theme of the multinational defense of the region, the solidarity of Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, the Karachi and Cherkess nationalities. Even a ski resort hotel has its war memorial room. All too well, I recall another such display in the ancient city of Pskov. In the History Museum, Anne and I suddenly passed from collections of icons, silver chalices, and drinking cups from Tsarist times into a room devoted to a panorama of the Battle of Pskov in 1944. Displays of captured German weapons, pictures of local heroes and their decorations, and grisly photographs of 5 partisans hanged by German soldiers. 2 men dangled from the gallows while 3 others were being led up to them. In another grotesque scene, 10 men in simple peasant garb were being shot in the town square in front of women and children who had been assembled to witness the execution. The effort to keep the wound of war from healing seemed masochistic, nor is there any sign that the practice is diminishing, for emphasis on wartime memories not only reinforces patriotic feelings, but points up the need for vigilance and readiness today. It was striking that in 1975, the 30th anniversary of the Allied victory over Germany brought such an outpouring of war propaganda in the press that some Western experts tabulated the flow as heavier than in 65 or 70. On the 20th and 25th anniversaries of victory in Europe. Sometimes the connection between war propaganda and current issues is quite explicit. A group of American university students camping through the Soviet Union in '72 after the first Nixon-Brezhnev summit came across a program at an outdoor movie theater in a campground near Orel in central Russia. A belligerent 1-hour documentary spliced film clips of North Vietnam being bombed by American jets, Israel air attacks on the Arabs, and the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union in World War II, as well as some wartime tank battles. It was all as if the war had ended only yesterday. One American shuddered later on. Why can't they leave it alone? Soviet cultural life is saturated with war theme, but almost always painted in heroic rather than gory colors. They don't want to raise a nation of pacifists. A Russian student commented to me, not only have a slew of such military terms as mobilizing the reserves and working a good watch at the factory become standard vocabulary for the economy, but the war theme is far and away the most popular subject for books and movies. Some are crudely chauvinistic, others are more subtle and interesting because Soviet authors have found that they can capitalize on the political sanctity of the war to attempt experimentation. A Belarusian writer named Vasil Bekov has gained a following for his psychological novellas about partisans, playing on which people break down and collaborate with the enemy and which go nobly to their deaths. Konstantin Semenov, a former war correspondent for Red Star, the armed forces newspaper, has become virtually the nation's most famous author, with his diaries and his novels flashing from battle scenes and strategic landscapes to semi-documentary views of wartime leaders. The avant-garde Taganka theater put on The Dawns Here Are Quiet, a very moving and effectively staged drama about some Russian women killed by Nazi forces near the Soviet-Finnish border. Other works chronicle reunions of veterans, the problems of women on the home front, the guilt of a young woman who has been unfaithful to her husband who dies at the front. War, a pulp novel by Ivan Studniak, stirs a jingoist mood and provides the most adoring portrait of Stalin in recent years. Hot Snow by Yuri Bondarev recalls the heroic defense of Stalingrad and inserts another flattering portrait of Stalin, remembered by one character as the man whose countenance had imprinted itself onto his mind more firmly, more indelibly than the faces of his dead father and mother. The granddaddy of the war movies in my years was Liberation. It completely bypasses the early war years when Stalin panicked and Russian forces were reeling in retreat, and tells the story of the turning of the tide up to the capture of the Reichstag in Berlin. Far too many other war stories and movies come out every year, to name even the leading ones. Suffice it to say that in any season, war books are always among the best sellers, and that for the Soviet screen, the war theme is more important than westerns are to Hollywood. Spy movies and spy novels are another addiction of Russians, for in a time of knocking intelligence agencies elsewhere, the Soviet spy remains a national hero, nor are they tongue-in-cheek stories a la James Bond. In late '74, while the American press was raking the Central Intelligence Agency over the coals for its roles in Chile, the Soviet press paid its perennial tribute to the Soviet super spy, Richard Sorge, who, posing as a Nazi correspondent in Tokyo, had informed the Kremlin in advance of the date of the Nazi invasion of Poland and Hitler's plans to attack the Soviet Union. The fact that Stalin ignored Sorge's warnings, however, is always omitted. By the time the CIA was being roasted for domestic intelligence snooping, New World, the most liberal of Soviet monthly magazines, was running an heroic novel about the campaign by Smersh, the Death to Spies counterintelligence agency, to wipe out nationalist, non-communist Polish partisans fighting the Nazis in 1944. The magazine dedicated the novel to the few to whom very many are indebted. For something comparable in America, the New Yorker would have to run a serial romanticizing Alan Dulles and Richard Helms, the two most popular Soviet television serials of recent years were 17 Instants in Spring and Shield and Sword, tales of Soviet master spies who infiltrated the Nazi hierarchy, run with little concern about the effect on détente. Yet in 1974, when Finnish television screened Silk Stockings, a 1957 American slapstick musical about Soviet agents in Paris, the Soviet embassy protested vigorously. The Russians have patriotic morality plays for every medium. Are one of the most striking numbers put on by the Moiseev dance troupe is a brilliantly dramatic dance called Partisans, done by dancers in great winged black Cossack coats that make each partisan dancer a forbidding hawk or raven. First, one partisan horseman appears, then another, then a stream of them gliding along smoothly, feet hidden beneath their cloaks, and moving at great speed as if riding on a dark night. Suddenly the dancers unfurl their ravenscapes and reveal all the various nationalities and walks of life. Young men, partisan girls, sturdy Slavs, Germanic-looking Baltic peoples, Eskimo-like Yakuts, Central Asians, railroad workers, soldiers, parachutists, sailors. The dance becomes a very effective display of the heroic unity and solidarity of all Soviet peoples, splendidly performed. In short, a stirring propaganda, reminder of the exploits of war, as well as an artistic hit. Soviet audiences love it, and it travels well all over the world. Few Russians over 35 need much prompting to recall the war. I heard many sad stories of personal ordeals, but a slender, spunky artist once entertained a roomful of people with humorous recollections of his war years as an aviation mechanic. Everyone was frantic, he said, to get his hands on any kind of alcohol to numb the pain, the cold, the fear. One of his favorite gimmicks was to drain the landing gear boxes of fluid and to filter the mixture of oils and spirits through gas masks. It was a slow, laborious process, but it made a bearable drink. Of course, he said, it left the planes tilting to one side after the fluid was removed. Another man, a tour guide in the Caucasus, had a more tolerant view of the Germans than most because some German soldiers saved him from execution. As a young teenager in an occupied zone, he was dragooned for a work crew and angered a German sergeant by letting a telephone pole fall against his shoulder. The infuriated sergeant motioned him to walk toward some nearby bushes and unsnapped his pistol holster. Other German soldiers, sensing what was about to happen, shouted at the sergeant, "Willie, we know you are mad, but don't do such a terrible thing." Twice the sergeant started to pull out the gun, and the others stopped him. Finally, the Russian said, "That sergeant cuffed me such a terrible blow that I flew 15 feet, but nothing more. So I can say there are human beings among the Germans. They saved my life, his views are more charitable than most. In Murmansk, a marine biologist who had lost a father and uncle and 7 other relatives in the war could hardly abide the policy of détente with West Germany. "I know the world needs peace," he said tautly, "but I hate the Germans. Privately, I have heard other Russians voice the fear that Brezhnev was going too far trusting Willy Brandt and the Germans. In Samarkand, I felt the sting of hostility some people still harbor toward Germans. A storekeeper took me for a German when I asked the price of some Uzbek hats he was selling and refused to answer. When I asked again, he snapped at me, 'We don't serve Germans here.' In Moscow, a young East German technician who was working and training at a factory about 150 miles from Moscow, towards Leningrad, told me he had been shocked by the antagonism of provincial Russians. 'They don't know in their hearts that the war is over,' he said. 'All they think is the Germans want to kill us and we want to kill Germans.' And I told them, 'But here I am, I'm a German, and I don't want to kill you. The war is over. We are building socialism in our part of Germany.' So afraid was this young man of Russian passions that he dared not go drinking with his fellow workers, even though he was on an officially sponsored work-study program. He was greatly distressed that these factory workers made no distinction between East and West Germany. I spent a whole day arguing with them and telling them that our part of Germany was friends with them and that we were building socialism," he said. "But it didn't seem to matter. For them, Germans were Germans and they hated us all." The powers that be, nonetheless, worry greatly that the patriotic dedication felt by those who lived through the war is not being forcefully enough transmitted to the young. Decrees are issued, movies critiqued, and writers' conferences held to promote that end. From an early age, the young get indoctrination in paying proper tribute to the sacrifices made during wartime. One scene indelibly imprinted in my memory is that of young children, boys and girls of 11 and 12, standing as honor guards at war memorials. I recall a windy fall afternoon in Odessa, where one memorial overlooked the sea. The sky was overcast, and the wind whipped up whitecaps. 4 children in the red scarves, white shirts, blue pants, and skirts of the young pioneers stood vigil. Rigid as soldiers, posted at the 4 corners of the memorial, I happened to arrive with a tour guide just as the guard was being changed. We stopped to watch. Down a long pathway marched a new contingent. Arms swinging widely, their slow pace reminiscent of the measured gait of the KGB guards at Lenin's tomb in Moscow. The crunch of gravel stones underfoot marked the cadence of their steps as they went through the ceremony, silent, disciplined, intensely devoted to the sacred duty of standing guard for the motherland. This is of a piece with the actual military training carried out nationwide in Soviet high schools, the universal draft for 18-year-olds, and the serious way in which Soviet university students are put through compulsory reserve officer programs. Our first exposure to this network of paramilitary activities in civilian life came when our 11-year-old daughter, Lori, went off to play Tsarnitsa Lightning, a war game on Lenin Hills, organized for the 6th and 7th grades by a military instructor at her Russian school. It would all have seemed very much like a summer camp game of capture the flag, except for the deadly earnestness with which it was done. Lori came home and told us that the two grades, children from 11 to 13, had first been drilled by a uniformed Army instructor in formation marching and making right faces and left faces. In our living room, she demonstrated marching and faces. They were divided into two teams. One assigned blue patches to sew on their sleeves, and the other assigned green patches. The blues were given a head start to scatter in the hills, like partisans, and the greens were to hunt them down, rip off their badges, and bring them back as prisoners. We couldn't play too long because it was very cold, Lori said. There was snow on the ground. I got cold because they left me guarding prisoners. Still, with the drilling and all, the expedition ran about 4 hours after school. It was a practice carried out in all schools. In the older grades, the complexity of the game increased as the instructors introduced primitive field tactics. Playing tennis not far from Lennon Hills, I would occasionally see teams of children darting through the woods playing Tsarnitsa. An American university student whom I knew was amazed one day to have spotted one group of students dressed in dark Navy uniforms not only capture their rivals but go through the ceremony of lining the captured partisans up against a wall and pretending to shoot them. The victims fell and died very realistically. That was but one of a number of activities, suggesting to me that the line separating civilian and military life, so pronounced in the West, far less important in Soviet society. The National Physical Fitness Program has the name Ready for Labor and Defense, Gotov k Trudu I Oboron. The television program, Come On Guys, is intended to popularize various military skills among the youth by running regional and national competitions in marksmanship, the art of self-defense, and aspects of Soviet law affecting military service. At 14, youngsters can join the Voluntary Committee for Assistance to the Armed Forces, a gung-ho organization with the stated objective of training civilians in the spirit of constant readiness for defense of the interest of the socialist motherland. DOSAAF, as it is known by its Russian initials, has no real counterpart in America. It combines the function of 4-H and National Guard with branches at farms, factories, institutes, and in city neighborhoods all over the Soviet Union. It is a vast apparatus. I was astonished to hear that a Soviet officer disclosed at a public lecture that the DOSAAF membership was 65 million. The organization gives courses in military history and tactics, develops civil defense facilities, teaches youngsters to drive, and maintains all kinds of vehicles, to operate and maintain radios and electrical equipment, to make and design aircraft models, to make parachute jumps, to shoot and to learn professions which have military importance. As one Soviet blurb put it, it runs driving clubs and schools. For dog lovers, it has a program supplying breeds suitable for military purposes. Those who accept such dogs and enroll them in training programs qualify for extra housing space. For men really serious about military careers, the Soviet Union has at least 135 military schools and colleges, graduating commissioned officers, compared to 10 such schools in the United States. The real introduction to military life for the youth of the entire nation comes in 9th and 10th grades. The last 2 years of ordinary Soviet high school, where boys and girls take an obligatory twice-a-week classroom course in military training and civil defense. The textbook, which a Russian friend gave me, opens with the black and white rhetoric of the Cold War. The USSR is a peace-loving nation. There is no crime which imperialists have not committed. The 1973 edition had 4 lines on Soviet-American détente, squeezed between warnings that the U.S. has not turned away from its aggressive course, and the requirements of military readiness have grown in recent years as imperialist circles, first of all the USA, heat up the international situation, without any lessening of the dangers of a new world war. This is for all high school students across the country. The textbook then moved quickly into a description of the Soviet armed forces, instructions on dismantling weapons, throwing grenades from trenches, firing weapons prone, making tank traps, and undertaking field maneuvers. Each summer, the high school boys go off to Army camp from 5 days to a month. They conduct long marches with a pack, take tactical field training, dig civil defense shelters, and fire weapons like the world-renowned Kalashnikov submachine guns used by guerrillas worldwide. The Soviet equivalent of the American basic training camps like Fort Dix and Fort Jackson are in the Soviet high schools. An American military attaché remarked to me, "They are paid for, not by the Ministry of Defense, but the Ministry of Education." In the late 60s, one Russian lad told me, "The enemy in field maneuvers and classroom lectures at summer camps used to be explicitly identified as Americans, but with the coming of détente in the 1970s, some camps fuzzed the identification, though youngsters still understood who was meant. The silhouettes at target ranges," this lad said, "all wear wide-brimmed headgear, a symbol of the Burgess, so that we are properly instructed in the Marxist class approach." Another lanky teenager confided to me that he had found the routine all too realistic, beginning with the first day head-to-toe search to make sure no one had smuggled alcohol or some other contraband into camp. "The food was so terrible I could hardly eat. I was hungry the whole time," he moaned. His father, a pacifist, was pleased when his son returned shed of romantic ideas about the army. "I didn't like the idea at first," the father confessed, "but it has its benefits. Now these boys have a realistic picture of the army. One result is that many young people strive desperately to get into some higher educational institution, any institution, to obtain a reserve commission and to avoid the compulsory 2-year draft. But in universities, too, the courses are more serious than American ROTC programs. In addition to the standard drill about ranks, formations, and military regulations, and a 2-month encampment before the senior year, the Soviet Army develops military applications for each student's academic specialty. Language students, one bearded young linguist told me, are prepared to become military translators. We learn all the terminology and nomenclature of American weapons in our courses to be ready for mobilization," he said. Biology students take courses in health measures in case of nuclear attack and study military parasitology and military microbiology, a girl biologist said. The girls at Moscow State University and elsewhere join the boys at the shooting range. I lay down next to the colonel, who was our instructor, and he showed me how to hold the Kalashnikov, smiled the biologist, a striking blonde with classic Slavic features, made even more striking by her narrow Tatar eyes. "I shot 3 times. I couldn't even hit the wall. They couldn't find my bullets, but the colonel liked me. He gave me a C." Periodically, the intense Soviet propaganda about World War II is used to bolster the policy of détente, especially as a prelude to the visit of some major Western leader. Just before Nixon's arrival in '72, Yevgeny Yevtushenko set the tone with an emotional poem about the meeting of American and Soviet troops at the Elbe River. That evoked happy memories of the wartime alliance and joint victory over Nazism. I ran into a fair number of middle-aged men with warm personal recollections of collaboration with Westerners, men who served at aerodromes where American planes landed or who worked at Murmansk, where the huge flow of Western Lend-Lease reached the Soviet Union, but far more frequently, Soviet propaganda passes over in silence the concrete acts of cooperation and raises points of mistrust and conflict. In Murmansk, for example, city officials paid lip service to wartime cooperation, but in the local museum, many rooms of which were devoted to displays about the war, there was not a single chance for Russian visitors to learn about Allied Lend-Lease. Amidst panoramic wall-to-wall photographs of the havoc wreaked on Murmansk by Nazi firebombing, I found an edition of Harper's Magazine opened to an article by Dave Marlowe, an American journalist who had reached Murmansk on an Allied convoy. He described the convoy under pursuit by German submarines and planes, and the relief of the crews at reaching their destination. Then he portrayed the depressing devastation of Murmansk, but the only part translated into Russian was the description of his impressions of Murmansk, without any reference to the gauntlet run by the convoys, the Allied aid, or why an American might be in Murmansk. Out of curiosity, I asked Yelena Pavlova, the enthusiastic museum director, if she had information on the number of Allied convoys or amount of Allied aid that passed through Murmansk. I never bumped into any such figures in all of my years here, she said. She advised trying the city's handsome new technical library. There the director, Vera Popova, a busty, imposing administratrix, proudly showed us around the bright, modern building for a couple of hours. After the tour, I inquired about the convoys. Researchers were confidently dispatched. After an hour or so, they returned with one thin volume reporting that in 1942, 93 Soviet ships were engaged in importing goods for the war effort, but nothing about British or American aid. More searching turned up nothing else, to the embarrassment of my official host, Nikolai Belyayev, the editor of Polar Truth, the local Communist Party newspaper. The next day, however, he showed up triumphantly with a book that had one passage referring to foreign seamen who guided their ships here in the days of war, but the point of the passage had nothing to do with aid, which was unmentioned. Rather, it cited the praise of the foreigners for the exploits of Soviet frontier guards, who helped douse fires on their vessels. A couple of ships were mentioned by name, but no nationality or reason for their being in Murmansk was given. Such awkward exclusions could only have been by design, meaning that censors had banned mentioning $15 billion in American and British aid to the Soviet war effort. Indeed, a Soviet journalist and a movie director later confirmed that to me. As a result, they said most Russians thought of American wartime aid as no more than Tashinka canned spam, which they belittled. The movie director considered it practically a revolutionary development that in 1973, Yuri Zakov, the Pravda commentator, had mentioned on TV that American aid had actually included planes, trucks, jeeps, spare parts, and other vital equipment. That is the first time in many years that our people have heard such things about your Lend-Lease, he said. I never heard the program repeated. For the Kremlin, a full and candid picture of the Western contribution to the Soviet war effort would not have accorded with the ethnocentric Soviet view of the war, a view that usually ignores its global aspect and sees Russia as a center and all else as a secondary sideshow. This is a fault of all nations, of course, but it is carried to an extreme by the Russians through censorship. It would have been a painful blow to national pride to admit that in time of need, Moscow had to lean on the West for help. Out of some deep-seated inferiority complex, this kind of information has always been suppressed. Whether wartime aid, the famine relief in the early 1920s, like Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration, treated in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia mainly as a cover for subversion and espionage, or the huge Russian grain purchase from America in 1972. Nor is the war automatically a symbol of Allied collaboration to Russians. Even today, they bear grudges against the West over the conduct of the war. For reasons of ideological solidarity, their celebrations often play on the modest wartime actions of Poles, Romanians, and Hungarians against the Nazis, and seldom make much of what the British, French, or Americans did. But beyond this official line of communist solidarity, I found myself besieged with the argument that the West had deliberately delayed the Normandy invasion to allow the Nazis to concentrate their force against the Russians. This is widely regarded by Russians as a purposeful act of betrayal. Many quote Stalin on this point, though they steadfastly ignore that Stalin's own pact with Hitler from 39 to 41 allowed the Germans to concentrate all their force against the British in the early war years without the distraction of a second front on the east. Most Americans do not think of this when challenged about Normandy. My own response was that we hardly wanted to bleed Russia since we were pumping in billions of dollars of Lend-Lease through Murmansk. And the Russian retort commonly was that American aid was niggardly Tashinka. This response came from a foreign ministry official and a well-established journalist who had reason to know better, as well as from ordinary people who may genuinely have been ignorant. Among those who knew and were prepared to admit that Western wartime aid had been more extensive, the response was usually, "But aid is only dollars and we paid in blood." Another burning wartime grievance, which affects the East-West climate today, is the widespread belief that in the final months of the war, the Allies secretly sought to make a peace deal with the Germans through Allen Dulles in Switzerland behind Moscow's back. That is the main theme of the popular television spy serial 17 Instants in Spring, a story which falsifies history to project the picture of double-dealing Americans. The Soviet spy, a handsome immigrant named Stirlitz, has wormed his way high into the ranks of the Gestapo and uncovered a plot by Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, to negotiate a separate peace with the West through Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the SS commander in Italy. This plot is allegedly blocked only by the brilliance of Stirlitz and the cunning mistrustfulness of Stalin, who senses Allied trickery. Although the television film and the story on which it was based were presented to the Soviet public as entirely based on facts, Moscow had no known super spy within the high reaches of the SS. Moreover, the author Yulian Semenov telescoped the actual time span of events to make the alleged Western betrayal appear more shameful, presenting a version of history contradicted by published diplomatic documents. According to State Department records of Soviet and American wartime communications released for publication in '68, the talks were initiated by an aide of Kesselring and involved potential surrender of Nazi forces in Italy, and only in Italy. The Soviet government was immediately informed by Ambassador Averell Harriman and was invited to participate in them. Nothing in the documents suggests Himmler's involvement or any broad political peace settlement with any Germans, but they do portray Stalin's near paranoid refusal to accept the good faith of American invitations for the Russians to take part in the talks, ultimately provoking President Roosevelt to protest in astonishment at Stalin's accusations. The television series was sufficiently touchy for Soviet authorities to have delayed its first screening until after Brezhnev had completed his visit to America in the summer of '73, but the caliber of the production, technically and dramatically, it was, far and away, the best television series which I saw in the Soviet Union, made it an instant hit. So popular was it that it was given a rerun that fall, and its political message had extra impact with a huge national audience. Not long after the series had run the second time, I discussed the show with an opera singer and an army captain who were sharing a train compartment with me from Leningrad to Moscow, both were firmly convinced that there had been an American betrayal near the end of the war, and my allusions to the documentary record did not interest them. It's a good thing that Stalin found out about it, or it would have made trouble for us, the opera singer declared. It's not pretty, but that's the way it was, the captain insisted just as adamantly. We have documentary proof of that. Of course, the movie was fictionalized, but we know what was done behind our backs.